The wedding that shouldn't be. The grand hall of the Salvator Empire was glowing with a strange golden light. Tall, alien pillars stretched toward the sky, covered in symbols no human could read. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, and the sound of low, eerie music filled the room. Captain Daniel Hayes stood at the center of it all, dressed in ceremonial robes he did not choose. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the hundreds of alien guests watching him. Their black, pupil-less eyes made them look like statues, cold and silent. This was his wedding day, but it did not feel like one. Daniel was a soldier, a diplomat, a man who had fought wars and seen the worst of the galaxy. He had survived ambushes, assassins, and betrayals. But today, standing in front of Queen Vakari, he felt truly afraid. She was beautiful in a haunting way. Her silver skin shimmered under the golden light, and her long, dark hair floated as if caught in a breeze that wasn't there. Her lips were curved in a slight smile. But her eyes, her black, endless eyes held something else. Something dangerous. A deal that went too far. This marriage was not for love. It was a deal, one made by Earth's leaders and the Salvator Empire to prevent war. The Salvators were powerful telepaths, rulers of a vast empire that Earth could not afford to fight. In exchange for peace, they demanded a human representative, a bondmate for their queen. And Daniel had been chosen. He had no choice. The survival of Earth depended on this moment. The ceremony continued, strange and unfamiliar. The Salvators spoke in their native tongue, their voices echoing inside his mind. Vakari reached out and touched his hands. Her skin was ice-cold, sending a shiver through his body. A deep voice filled the room, coming from an unseen source. The bond is sealed. The alien guests bowed their heads in respect. The music stopped. Silence took over the hall. It was done. Daniel Hayes was no longer a free man. Alone at last. Now it begins. As soon as the ceremony ended, the guests began to leave. Some whispered among themselves, their voices soft and eerie. Others cast Daniel strange looks, as if he was something to be pitied. Vakari took his hand and guided him toward the palace corridors. Her touch was firm, unshakable. Daniel's instincts screamed at him, telling him to pull away, to run. But he forced himself to stay calm. Then, as the doors closed behind them, leaving them alone in the vast, shadowy halls of her palace, Vakari finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but her words sent ice through his veins. Alone at last. Now it begins. Daniel stiffened. He turned to look at her, but her expression did not change. What begins? He asked, his throat dry. She smiled. A slow, knowing smile. You will understand soon, she said. And then she led him deeper into the palace, where the shadows seemed darker, the walls seemed to breathe, and the whispers in his mind grew louder. Daniel Hayes had survived battles. He had survived war. But something told him, this was just the beginning. A prison in disguise. The grand corridors of the Salvator Palace stretched endlessly, bathed in a dim, eerie glow. The walls were smooth, seamless, and strangely organic, pulsing ever so slightly, as if the palace itself were alive. Daniel Hayes followed Queen Vakari through the winding halls, his every step echoing in the unnatural silence. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but there was no turning back. The doors behind him had sealed shut the moment they entered. Vakari walked with grace, her dark robes flowing behind her like liquid shadows. She never looked back, but somehow he felt her eyes on him, inside him. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Daniel clenched his fists. He was not a helpless man. He had survived battles, fought against forces far stronger than himself. He would not be broken. Yet, something about this place unsettled him in a way no battlefield ever had. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a large chamber. The doors slid open without a sound, revealing a room so vast it could fit a small city inside. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. A room with no escape. The walls were lined with floating lights, hovering like fireflies, casting long, shifting shadows across the polished floor. In the center of the room stood an enormous glass-like structure, suspended in midair by unseen forces. Strange symbols flickered across its surface, constantly changing as if whispering in a forgotten language. Vekari gestured toward it. "This will be your quarters," she said. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Quarters. He stepped forward, scanning the room for any obvious threats. More like a cage. Vekari chuckled softly, the sound smooth yet devoid of warmth. A cage. She tilted her head, studying him. "No, Captain Hayes. This is a sanctuary." Daniel had spent enough time in enemy territory to recognize a lie when he heard one. "Sanctuary," he repeated, his voice dry. "And yet, I get the feeling I'm not allowed to leave." She smiled. "That depends." "On what?" Her black, bottomless eyes locked onto his. "On how long you last." The way she said it made his blood turn cold. "The walls are watching." Vekari stepped forward, her presence both commanding and unnervingly silent. She extended a pale hand, touching the glass-like structure. Immediately, the surface rippled, transforming into a holographic display. Images flashed, stars, planets, swirling nebulae, and then Earth. Daniel's jaw tightened. It was a live feed, the familiar blue and green sphere spinning gently in space. "Your world," Vekari mused, tilting her head. "Still so young, so full of potential." He said nothing, his mind racing. This was not just about him. This was about Earth. "I have been watching your people for a long time, Captain Hayes," Vekari continued, tracing her fingers across the images. "Humans are fascinating. So fragile, yet so stubborn. So quick to destroy, yet so eager to survive." Daniel forced himself to remain calm. "Why am I really here?" She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "To belong. To be part of something greater." He let out a bitter laugh. "I was sent here to prevent a war, not to belong to an alien queen." Vekari's lips curled into something that could have been amusement or warning. "Every human who has come before you has thought the same." Daniel froze. "Before me?" She did not answer. Instead, she stepped back. The glass-like structure shifted again, revealing something that made his breath catch in his throat. A recording. An old, grainy transmission of a human man, standing in the very same chamber. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. And then he spoke. "If you are watching this, then it's already too late. The ones who came before." Daniel stared at the screen, his pulse hammering. The man in the recording looked exhausted, his uniform tattered. His voice trembled as he continued. "They tell you this is a diplomatic union, a bridge between species, but it's a lie." Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine. "That Exalvators don't marry for love. They don't marry for peace." The man swallowed hard. "They consume." Vekari remained silent, watching Daniel closely. The recording flickered. The man looked over his shoulder, as if sensing something in the shadows. His breathing grew ragged. "I don't know how much time I have left. They take something from you. Your strength. Your mind." His voice cracked. "Your soul." The screen cut to static. Daniel turned to Vekari, his fists clenched. "What the hell is this?" She only smiled. "You are mine now, Captain Hayes," she whispered. The doors behind her slid shut. The room darkened, and the walls began to whisper the truth behind the wedding. The whispers did not stop. They slithered through the air like unseen fingers, brushing against Daniel Hayes' skin. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. Just the smooth, seamless walls of the Salvator Palace, walls that pulsed, shifted, breathed. This place was wrong. He had been in alien prisons before, He had fought his way out of impossible situations, but this was something else. This was not just a prison. This was a trap, and he had walked straight into it. The Forgotten Ones, the recording of the man, gaunt, desperate, terrified, flickered once more before vanishing into static. Daniel clenched his fists. How many before him? How many humans had stood in this same room, asking the same questions, feeling the same fear? He turned to face Vicari, his heart hammering. Who was he? Vicari only smiled. That same, slow, knowing smile that made his blood run cold. A reminder, she said softly. That resistance is meaningless. Daniel took a step forward, his muscles tensed. What did you do to him? Vicari studied him with those endless, black eyes. The same thing I will do to you. A ritual, not a marriage. The air in the room thickened. Daniel felt it pressing against him, not physically, but mentally. Something was inside his head. Not words, not thoughts, something deeper. A force, a presence. It pressed against his mind, coiling around his thoughts like a snake. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the glass-like structure for balance. You feel it now, Vicari said, watching him with fascination. The bond. Daniel gritted his teeth. Get out of my head. Vicari chuckled. I never left. The walls pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, morphing into words, voices overlapping. They were speaking to him. Or worse, they were memories. The hunger of the Salvators. Images flashed through his mind. Not his memories. Memories of others. A woman in a similar chamber, eyes sunken, skin pale, whispering words he couldn't understand. A man screaming in the dark, grasping at his own reflection as his face slowly faded. More and more faces, more and more voices. Hundreds, thousands, all human. Daniel gasped and ripped himself away from the images. The room blurred, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if he was standing or falling. His breathing was ragged. He was sweating. His vision swam. Vicari stood before him, watching patiently. Your mind is strong, she said. That pleases me. Daniel wiped his face and took a shaky step back. What are you doing to me? Vicari tilted her head. You already know. Daniel swallowed. He didn't want to say it. He didn't want it to be true. But it was. You're feeding. Vicari's smile widened. You understand faster than most. A wave of nausea rolled through him. He pressed a hand against the cold floor, forcing himself to steady. How? Vicari walked toward him, slow and deliberate. The Salvators do not simply consume food, Captain Hayes. We consume essence, thought, life. She crouched before him, her black eyes locking onto his. Our kind does not simply conquer planets. We take their people. We take their minds. We take their strength. Daniel's pulse pounded. That's why you wanted this marriage. Vicari's fingers traced the edge of his jaw, cold as ice. You are an offering, Captain Hayes, a gift from your world. Daniel jerked away, stumbling to his feet. No. Vicari rose gracefully, unfazed. You think you have a choice. Daniel glared at her. I don't just think it. I know it. The Queen's test. Vicari sighed, almost disappointed. Your defiance is predictable. She lifted a hand, and suddenly, Daniel's body locked in place. He gasped. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Not telekinesis, something deeper. Something was inside him, holding him in place. Vicari stepped closer, placing her hand over his chest. The pressure increased. His lungs burned. His heartbeat slowed. I could take what I want right now, she whispered. I could drain your will, turn you into another hollow voice in the walls. Daniel fought against the invisible force, his teeth clenched. No, he would not be broken. Not here. Not now. The first crack in the armor. A sharp sound echoed through the room. A crack. Vicari froze. Another crack. Then another. The glass-like walls began to fracture. The whispers inside them screamed. Vicari hissed and turned away, her focus momentarily breaking. The hold on Daniel vanished. He fell to the ground, gasping for air. His body trembled, but his mind sharpened. Something had interrupted her control, and it wasn't him. Vicari turned to the walls, her expression unreadable. "It seems we have company." Daniel staggered to his feet. What the hell was that? Vicari's eyes darkened. A mistake. The cracks in the glass spread like lightning. The whispers turned into shouts. Daniel backed away, his instincts flaring. Whatever was happening, it wasn't part of her plan. For the first time, he saw uncertainty in Vicari's face. That Salvatars were predators, but even predators had things they feared. And whatever was waking up inside these walls terrified her. The Queen's secret weakness. The walls of the Salvator Palace screamed. It was not a sound Daniel Hayes could hear with his ears. It was inside his mind, clawing at the edges of his thoughts, filling his head with overlapping voices. Some were human. Some were alien. All were trapped. The cracks in the glass-like structure spread, glowing faintly, like veins pulsing with some unseen force. The air around him felt thicker, as if the very atmosphere was pressing against his skin. Daniel staggered back, pulse hammering. Vicari's expression had changed. Gone was the cold, knowing smile. Now she looked unsettled, not afraid, but close. And that meant something was wrong. For the first time since he had arrived in this cursed place, Daniel saw a weakness. Something is fighting back. Vicari stepped toward the fractured wall, her silver fingers hovering over the cracks. She whispered something in her native tongue. The words were sharp, precise, meant to command, to control. But nothing happened. The cracks deepened. The voices inside them screamed louder. Vicari's hand twitched. "This is unexpected." Daniel wiped sweat from his brow, breathing hard. He had no idea what was happening, but he could feel it. Something inside these walls was alive. And it hated her. The last prisoner. A sudden gust of wind, from nowhere, rushed through the chamber. Daniel shivered. The temperature had dropped. Then, behind him, a new voice spoke. "You're different from the others." Daniel spun around, fists raised. The figure standing in the shadows was human, or what was left of one. The man's body was thin, his uniform tattered and discolored. His skin was too pale, as if it had not seen sunlight in years. His eyes were wrong. Not hollow, not lifeless, but filled with something else. Rage. Vicari's entire posture changed. Her hands clenched. "You should not be here." The man ignored her, stepping closer to Daniel. "I was like you once," he said. His voice was hoarse, as if he had spent years whispering secrets to himself in the dark. "I thought I could fight back, that I could survive." Daniel's gut tightened. "What happened to you?" The man's mouth twitched into a humorless smile. "She happened." Daniel turned back to Vicari, his blood boiling. "How many?" She tilted her head. "How many what?" "How many humans have you drained? How many have died in this place?" Her eyes gleamed. "Does it matter?" Daniel's fists clenched. The man in rags exhaled. "They don't just feed on us. They take everything. Your memories, your will, piece by piece, until you are nothing but a voice in the walls." Daniel glanced at the cracked glass. The whispers. They weren't just echoes. They weren't just energy. They were the dead. Vicari stepped between them. Enough. But the man only grinned, something wild and unbroken in his expression. "You're losing control, aren't you, my queen?" Daniel's heart pounded. That was it. The cracks in the walls, the voices screaming louder, the flicker of doubt in Vicari's expression. She wasn't as powerful as she wanted him to believe. There was a limit to her control, and something inside this palace was pushing back. The weakness of a god. Daniel turned to the man. How do I stop her? The man's grin widened. You can't. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's not an answer. The man chuckled, shaking his head. She's been feeding off humans for years. You think you can fight that? I fought worse. The man studied him for a long moment. Then softly, he said, she's not invincible. Valkyrie moved. Faster than Daniel had ever seen, her hand shot forward like a spear. Before the man could react, her fingers pierced through his chest. He gasped, his body going rigid, his eyes widening in shock. Daniel lunged forward, but an invisible force slammed into him, throwing him back against the wall. The impact knocked the breath out of his lungs. He groaned, struggling to move, but his limbs felt heavy. Valkyrie whispered something in her native tongue, and the man convulsed. His body withered before Daniel's eyes. His skin shrank, his hair turned to dust, his muscles collapsed inward as if something was draining him dry. And then, he was gone. Nothing left but a pile of ash. The force holding Daniel vanished. He hit the ground, coughing, his mind reeling. Valkyrie turned to him, calm once more. Do not seek hope where there is none. Daniel pushed himself up, breathing hard. His eyes burned with fury. She was lying. She wouldn't have been so desperate to kill that man if he didn't have the truth. She wouldn't be afraid of the cracks in the palace if they didn't mean something. Daniel knew the truth now. She was powerful, but she was not unbreakable. A dangerous gamble. Valkyrie stepped toward him, tilting her head. Your defiance is admirable. Daniel wiped blood from his lip. And your fear is showing. Her expression darkened. You misunderstand. I do not fear you. Daniel smirked. No, you fear what's coming. She said nothing, because she knew he was right. The palace trembled. The cracks in the walls spread further. The whispers turned into a roar. Something ancient was waking up. And for the first time since he arrived in this cursed place, Daniel had the advantage. The deadly game begins. The palace was dying. Daniel could feel it beneath his feet, the way the ground trembled. The walls groaned like a wounded beast. The cracks in the smooth glass-like surface had spread like fractures in a mirror, and the whispers. The whispers were screaming. Something was inside this place. Something old. Something hungry. And it was waking up. Valkyrie stood motionless in the dim light, her silver skin reflecting the glow of the failing walls. She was listening, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her black, bottomless eyes to Daniel. You think this changes anything? Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow, his pulse pounding. I think it changes everything. Valkyrie exhaled softly. You have no idea what you've done. Daniel smirked, despite the weight in his chest. Neither do you. And for the first time since he had arrived in this cursed place, Valkyrie didn't have an answer. The walls know your name. The air grew colder. Daniel could see his breath now, misting in the unnatural chill. The entire palace was shaking, not from an explosion, not from an attack, but from something inside. And then he felt it. A presence. Not like Valkyrie's. Not like the Salvator's silent, suffocating mental grip. This was different. Stronger. Angrier. It had been waiting. The whispers in the walls twisted into words. He does not belong to you. Daniel's breath hitched. He didn't just hear it. He felt it. The words pressed into his skull, burning through his thoughts. Valkyrie took a step back, her fingers twitching at her sides. She wasn't in control anymore. Daniel swallowed hard. What the hell was that? Valkyrie turned to him, her face expressionless. But her voice carried something he hadn't heard before. Tension. The first. Daniel frowned. The first what? She exhaled, tilting her head. The first of us. The truth about the Salvators. Daniel stiffened. He had spent years studying alien cultures, fighting in wars, negotiating peace. He had read every classified document about the Salvator Empire, but no one had ever mentioned this. No one speaks of it, Vekari continued, her gaze distant, because to speak of it is to invite it back. Daniel's gut twisted. You're saying there's something worse than you. Vekari turned to the walls. The cracks pulsed, glowing with a dark, shifting energy. She ignored his question. Instead, she walked toward the massive glass-like structure in the center of the chamber, the heart of the palace. Her fingers brushed against its surface, and it responded to her touch, flickering between images of stars, planets, distant galaxies. Then, an ancient city. Daniel stepped closer, eyes narrowing. What is that? Vekari exhaled. The beginning. The image zoomed in, showing massive spiraling towers stretching toward a violet sky. It was unlike any civilization Daniel had ever seen. Far older than Earth, older than anything in human history. And then the image changed. The towers crumbled. The sky darkened. The city collapsed. And in the center of the destruction stood a shadow. It had no face, no form, just a shifting void, warping the air around it like heat rising from burning metal. Daniel felt a sharp pain in his head, like something was trying to pull him in. He gritted his teeth. What is that? Vekari turned to him. Our creator. Daniel stared at her. You're telling me that thing made you? Vekari's gaze darkened. No. I'm telling you. It still owns us. A predator turned prey. Daniel's mind reeled. The Salvators were supposed to be unstoppable. A race of powerful telepaths who controlled vast regions of the galaxy. But this was something else. This thing, Daniel said slowly. It's inside the palace, isn't it? Vekari's silence was all the confirmation he needed. A cold weight settled in his stomach. She was afraid. Vekari, the all-powerful queen of a telepathic empire, the creature that had been draining humans for centuries, was afraid. Daniel had spent days in this place, thinking he was the one trapped. But he wasn't. Vekari was. The entire palace was. And now, whatever had been sleeping wanted out. The hunt begins. The lights in the chamber flickered. The air thickened. Then, everything went dark. A second later, the screams started. Not whispers. Not echoes. Screams. Daniel's hands curled into fists as he turned in the darkness, his heart pounding. Something was moving in the shadows. Something big. Vekari's voice was sharp, urgent. Stay close to me. Daniel barked a laugh. You mean the thing that's been feeding off my mind this whole time wants to protect me now? Vekari turned to him, her expression hard. Do you think I would let you die so easily? Daniel exhaled sharply. He didn't trust her. Not even for a second. But right now, she was the only thing standing between him and whatever was coming. A low guttural growl rippled through the chamber. The ground beneath them shook. Vekari clenched her fists, her silver skin glowing faintly in the darkness. It knows. Daniel swallowed. Knows what? Vekari's black eyes gleamed. That I do not need you alive to consume you. Daniel took a step back, heart hammering. What the hell are you? But before he could finish, the walls exploded. A wave of darkness poured into the chamber, swallowing everything in its path. Daniel dove to the ground, covering his head as the force of it slammed into him like a physical weight. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Then, the darkness spoke. Vekari, you are no longer queen here. Vekari's body stiffened. Daniel forced himself to his feet, eyes wide. Vekari, the unshakable, powerful ruler of the Salvators, had finally lost control. And now, they were both prey, breaking the chains of the empire. The darkness swallowed everything. Daniel Hayes had faced death before. He had survived ambushes, battles, and betrayals. But this was something else. It was not just darkness. It was alive. He felt it pressing against his skin, slithering around his limbs, pushing into his mind like a parasite trying to burrow deep inside his thoughts. And then it spoke again. "Vekari, your reign is over." Daniel gasped, his body tensing. The voice was not human. It was deep, layered, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, woven together into something ancient and hungry. He turned toward Vekari. For the first time, the mighty queen of the Salvator looked small. Her glowing silver skin was dimming. Her hands trembled at her sides, and her jaw was clenched in an expression that could only mean one thing: fear. Real, raw fear. Daniel took a step back. "What the hell is that?" Vekari's voice was quieter than before. "It is the end. The ancient horror awakens." The chamber shook. The glass-like walls cracked further, the fractures pulsing with a sickly red light. The whispers, no. The screams grew louder. The voices of all the humans, all the creatures that had been consumed here, filled the air like a chorus of agony. And then, the darkness moved. A shape began to take form in the center of the chamber. It was not solid, not in the way a body should be. It was shifting, twisting, constantly changing. Daniel's breath hitched. It had no face, no eyes, just a swirling mass of black, writhing tendrils that pulsed with an eerie, almost living light. It stepped forward, the air warping around it, as if reality itself struggled to contain its presence. Vekari staggered back. "No, I sealed you away." The thing's voice rumbled, shaking the chamber. "You stole my power, my people, my empire, and now you will return it." Daniel's mind raced. This thing, it was part of the Salvator's history, not just part of it. It created them. And now, it was here to take everything back. Vekari's true fear. Vekari turned sharply toward Daniel, her dark eyes gleaming. "We must leave. Now." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You expect me to trust you?" Vekari hissed. "If it takes me, you die. If it consumes me, it will consume you." Daniel clenched his fists. He hated that she was right. But then he saw something in her face, a flicker of something more than fear. Panic. She couldn't stop it. The queen of the Salvators, the most feared telepathic species in the galaxy, was powerless. Daniel smirked. "This is new for you, isn't it?" Vekari's head snapped toward him. "You're always in control, always the predator." He took a step forward, testing his theory. "But now, you're prey." Vekari's nostrils flared. "Do not test me, human." Daniel shrugged. "What are you gonna do? Drain me?" He gestured at the thing stepping toward them. "I think you have bigger problems." She turned back toward the shadow. It was watching her. Not moving, not speaking, just waiting. And that was when Daniel realized it wasn't here for him. It was here for her, the birth of a monster. Vekari took a slow, shaky breath. "It wants what I took." Daniel frowned. "And what exactly did you take?" She turned to him, her black eyes flashing. "My kind was created to serve it," she said softly. "But I broke free. I stole its power, and I built my empire on its ashes." Daniel's stomach twisted. "So what? This thing is your god?" Vekari's expression darkened. "A god? No, a master." Daniel exhaled sharply. "And you've been running ever since." Vekari stiffened. Daniel laughed. "That's it, isn't it? You've been feeding on humans, feeding on every species you conquer, not because you're strong, but because you're weak." She didn't deny it. Daniel grinned. "You've been buying time." Vekari's hands curled into fists. "If I fall, you fall with me." Daniel's smirk faded. She was right. The darkness shifted. The tendrils stretched toward them, the air crackling with raw ancient energy. It was done waiting. Vekari snarled, raising her hands. Her body flared with light, energy pulsing through her silver skin. The force of it pushed Daniel backward, making his teeth rattle. She unleashed a wave of power, the same power she had stolen. The creature laughed. Not in a way that was human, not in a way that made sense. It laughed in his mind. And then it struck. Tendrils of living darkness lashed forward, wrapping around Vekuri's throat, lifting her off the ground. She let out a strangled cry, her body convulsing as the energy was ripped from her. Daniel's heart pounded. She was losing. The unbreakable queen, the nightmare of humanity, the monster who had kept him prisoner, was breaking. And then Daniel saw his chance. The gambit. Vekuri was no longer the biggest threat in the room. And she wasn't the only one who could steal power. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing onto her wrist. The instant he touched her, a jolt of raw energy slammed into his body, flooding his nerves with pure power. His mind screamed. His muscles locked. But he held on. He could feel it. The connection between her and the creature. The endless loop of energy and control. If he could break it, if he could sever the bond between them, he could win. Daniel gritted his teeth, focusing. Push. His vision blurred, his body burning with power not meant for him. But he pushed. The darkness shuddered. Vekuri let out a strangled gasp. The creature recoiled. And then, the palace exploded. A wave of pure force erupted outward, shattering the chamber, tearing through the walls like a tidal wave. The shadows screamed. The glass walls collapsed. And in the chaos, Daniel fell into the abyss, alone at last. The final battle. Daniel Hayes was falling. The shattered remains of the Salvator Palace collapsed around him, glass-like walls dissolving into dust as the force of the explosion ripped through the structure. His body tumbled through the air, weightless, spinning uncontrollably. The last thing he remembered was grabbing Vekuri's wrist, the surge of alien energy burning through his veins like molten fire. Then, the explosion. Then, this. A void. A black abyss stretching in all directions, swallowing everything. But he wasn't alone. The whispers were still here. The thing that had awakened was still here. And Vekuri. Somewhere in the darkness, she was still alive. The god in the shadows. Daniel landed hard, his body slamming onto a surface that shouldn't exist. It felt like stone, but it rippled like liquid beneath him. He gasped for breath, rolling onto his back. Above him, the shattered remnants of the palace hung in the air, frozen in time. And beyond them, the creature loomed. It was no longer a shapeless void. It had taken form now, a massive, towering figure, humanoid in shape but utterly alien. Its body pulsed with shifting patterns of light, dark veins stretching through its translucent skin. Its face had no features, just a swirling vortex, a hole where its head should be. But its voice was everywhere. You are nothing, just another voice for the walls. Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing himself up onto his knees. His entire body ached, his muscles weak, but he was still alive. And if he was alive, he could fight. You talk too much, Daniel growled. The entity tilted its head. And then it struck. A tendril of pure darkness shot toward him like a spear, cutting through the air. Daniel barely dodged, rolling to the side as the tendril slammed into the ground, sending a shockwave through the surface. The creature was fast. Too fast. Daniel scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. He had no weapons, no armor, no backup. But he had something else. Vekuri's power. The Queen's final stand. Daniel turned sharply as movement flickered in the shadows. Vekuri was there. She was kneeling on the ground, her silver skin dim and cracked, her breathing ragged. The explosion had weakened her, but she was still alive. The creature turned toward her. You are mine, Vekuri. The Queen of the Salvators lifted her head. Even now, she refused to bow. Her black eyes burned as she stood, her body glowing with defiance. I was yours, she said coldly. Not anymore. She lifted her hand, and the air shook. A shockwave of raw telepathic energy burst from her, slamming into the creature's chest. The force of it rippled outward, sending cracks through the ground beneath them. Daniel felt it too. The power. It wasn't just hers anymore. It was his. The connection hadn't broken. When he had grabbed her wrist, when the explosion had torn through the palace, he had absorbed part of her power. And now he could feel it. Like fire coursing through his veins, like a storm trapped inside his skull. Daniel clenched his fists. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was something more, a human against a god. The creature lunged. Daniel and Valkyrie moved together. She struck first, her body flickering with pure energy, a blade of light forming in her hand. She slashed upward, cutting through one of the creature's tendrils. The thing roared, a soundless, mind-shattering vibration that cracked the ground beneath them. Daniel followed, instincts kicking in. He had no weapon, so he made one. He focused, channeling the burning power inside him. And suddenly, his right hand ignited. Not with fire, not with heat, with pure will. A solid blade of glowing energy extended from his arm, humming with raw power. The creature turned toward him just as he drove it forward. The blade pierced its chest. For the first time, the entity screamed. The air shattered. Reality fractured. And then, everything collapsed. The last moment. Daniel gasped, his body falling again. Falling through the void. Falling through nothing. And then, he landed, but not in darkness, not in the void, not in the ruins of the palace. He landed on solid ground. Grass, air, sunlight. Daniel opened his eyes. He was standing on a hilltop, overlooking a vast landscape. The sky above him was blue, Earth's sky. The wind rushed past him, carrying the scent of trees of home. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, Valkyrie stood, her body still glowing faintly, her expression unreadable. Daniel exhaled. We made it. Valkyrie tilted her head. Did we? Daniel turned, and his breath caught. In the distance, the city stood, his city, New London. But something was wrong. In the center of the skyline, a crack shimmered in the air, stretching across the horizon like a wound in reality. Not fully open, not fully closed. And from deep within that crack, something watched them. The battle was over. But the war had just begun.